second. Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy, and I'm so pleased today to be here with Fincina Hopgood. Thank you, Fincina, for joining me for this dialogue.
Thanks for inviting me, Edwin. Thank you.
Yeah, and as we noticed from the accent, you're speaking from Australia.
Yeah,
and
I'm from Melbourne.
From Melbourne. Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I spent 8 months in my teens traveling around Australia. So I worked in a cheese factory there and did all kinds of different jobs. So I really love the country.
Yeah, it's a vast country, and it's quite different in different parts of Australia too. So yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a little bit different. What conversation? Because we want to talk about that you were a co-convenor of a symposium entitled "Try Walking in My Shoes: Empathy and Portrayals of Mental Illness on the Screen," and this was held at the University of Melbourne in February 13, 14, 2014. And so you put together this symposium, co-convened, and you also have your PhD in the portrayal of mental illness in film. So we wanted to kind of chat about your experience, and maybe you can introduce yourself a bit more if there's anything else you'd like to add.
Sure. Well, essentially, I'm a film studies scholar. That's my field of expertise. So I should say up front, particularly when we're dealing with mental health, that I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I'm someone who studies cinema. I also study a bit of TV, but film's really my background, and my specialisation is Australian films in particular. So I guess my interest in empathy really began with my PhD research, which was in the first half of the 2000s. And I was interested in researching those Australian films that had characters, protagonists, who were dealing with mental illness or who were treated as if they were mentally ill. And so I began to explore how the filmmakers approached this question of, okay, we have a character who's either diagnosed as mentally ill or who is suffering from a form of mental illness, but because they're the protagonist, the hero or the heroine of the story, we want the audience to be with them through that journey. And so I was kind of interested in what these Australian films were doing. Perhaps the most well-known example for an American audience would be the film Shine with Jeffrey Rush and Noah Taylor. So I was looking at this group of films that were produced in the 1990s, which historically is an interesting period of time in Australia. In the 1990s, that was the period when many people with mental illness were being deinstitutionalised and released back into the community, back into homes, back into public living, rather than being in institutions. And I think what these films were doing were kind of giving the audience an opportunity to, rather than laugh at someone with mental illness or be afraid of someone with mental illness, to actually empathise with them and to basically go on an emotional journey with them. So that's really where my interest in empathy began, was with that PhD research. And I guess it's then taken me along a journey since then to start exploring other films dealing with mental illness. So I now look at other films both from Australia and beyond. I'm looking more at TV shows now as well. So obviously shows like Homeland or United States of Tara that you would know. But I'm also interested in empathy because, of course, the scholarship in empathy is just exploding, in all disciplines: philosophy, psychology, education. And in terms of education, I'm also a teacher. So I teach a subject at Melbourne Uni, a master's subject called Human Rights on Screen. And we look at feature films and documentaries that deal with human rights issues and try to engage the audience's empathy with various characters through those films to actually raise awareness about not just mental health issues, but human rights issues more broadly. So I guess the empathy question drives both my research and my teaching.
What is it that triggered your interest in empathy? Was there some kind of something that you saw and you said, oh, empathy, this is like really important, I have to really focus on this in my work? Was there like an actual moment or something?
It's one of the things that's a real pleasure, I think, when you engage in a long-term research project like a PhD thesis, is that you never quite know where the journey is going to take you. So at the outset, I wouldn't have said, I'm going to research empathy. I didn't know that's where I was going to end up. It just started with a really basic question. What are the sorts of, I guess, creative decisions that a filmmaker, an actor, a writer, a director, what sort of creative decisions are they making when they're deciding to portray a character with mental illness in a way that isn't negative, that doesn't reinforce stereotypes? What are some alternatives, because I'd read a lot of the literature around mental illness in film and TV, and most of the literature at that point, understandably, was focusing on stereotypes in particular, stigma, the way in which these portrayals reinforce negative stigmas about people with mental illness, and particularly that very dangerous, pernicious connection of violence with mental illness, you know, which is really quite pervasive even today. So I guess it started with the question of, well, what are these Australian films offering that's different for the viewer, you know? So if the viewer's not laughing at someone with mental illness, if they're not afraid of them, if they're not feeling sorry for them, what are they feeling? And I basically eliminated all these other options and said, you know what they are feeling? They're feeling with them. You know, they're feeling that emotional engagement, they're feeling their pain, but they're also feeling their joy. So particularly if you look at Shine, it's so clear David Heathcote is the hero of the film. He is the romantic hero of the film. You know, there's a love story in Shine, and we're encouraged to kind of go with him on that emotional journey. It's also that journey of the artist struggling to come back from, you know, a devastating illness and reclaim his, you know, artistic integrity. So every step of the way in a film like Shine, we're with him. And I thought, what is that journey that the audience is being invited to go on? And I thought it's a journey of empathy. Now, of course, empathy in film is very different to empathy in real life. I should say that up front. So obviously, you're dealing with characters on a screen. Although we can have an emotional response to those characters, we know they're not real people. So even when they're based on someone's real life story, which Shine was based on a real story, I think as an audience we're not convinced that it's, you know, someone we're empathising with. So I should say up front, the kind of empathy I look at, I almost think it's like an act of imagination. So as an audience member, you're willing to imaginatively put yourself in the shoes of David Heathcote, or put yourself in the shoes of someone like Janet Frame in An Angel at My Table, which was another film I looked at. And that's kind of that willingness of the audience to go along for the emotional journey. And we all know that some audiences reject that. Some audiences don't like to feel manipulated. They like to keep a distance from their films they're watching. And I guess that's something that as film scholars we recognise, that all films promote different responses, different reactions. But for me, it's just interesting to explore that question. Okay, as a filmmaker, what are some of the decisions you're making if you wish to encourage that relationship of empathy?
So is it you're kind of wanting the sense of connection, like you're talking about, like stereotypes and maybe judgments and a lot of things that maybe scare people, and what you're really looking for is how do you really connect with the characters. I mean, in a real sense of connection, maybe coming more, I don't know if this is it, but maybe moving more towards a truthful or accurate portrayal.
Yeah, well, that interesting point of truthfulness and accuracy is obviously really important when you're dealing with mental health. And I don't know so much about the situation in America, but certainly in Australia recently there's been a great deal more advocacy on the part of mental health organisations to actually be involved in informing filmmakers and TV producers about ways in which they can present mental illness on screen that is more accurate, more truthful and more sensitive. Now, recognising that, you know, obviously a TV show or a film is not the same as a medical research paper, I think these days, you know, filmmakers are more sensitive to their, I guess, their ethical obligations when it comes to representing something that's quite sensitive on screen. So we have a number of fantastic mental health organisations here in Australia, one called SANE Australia, S-A-N-E, and there's another organisation that have developed guidelines called Mindframe, which are guidelines for the media in terms of how you should be portraying mental illness. And I think what they're trying to do is they're offering filmmakers and TV producers tools, research tools that they can draw upon to basically create a portrayal of mental illness that is more authentic, more complex, and actually in some ways more creative. Because at the end of the day, stereotypes, you know, reinforcing that old stereotype of the mad genius or the idiot savant or the psycho killer, that's kind of lazy storytelling, really. And the challenge, I think, is to get beyond those lazy stereotypes and create a character that's new and different, that hasn't been seen before. And I think the audience really responds to that.
Well, you'd also mentioned that that film is doing sort of an imaginative empathy, which got me thinking about how are you defining empathy? I've talked to some of the the academics in empathy, and they say there's all these different terminology, different understandings of empathy, and it's important that when you first start your conversation, what is the definition you're operating from, and that might give us more of a common ground for the discussion.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I should say I've found your website a fabulous resource for these discussions around empathy, and I really particularly enjoyed your interview with Marco Iacoboni, where he talked about this idea that there were multiple definitions. And whether... Is that okay, that sound effect in the background?
Yeah,
is that me?
That's me. I have the window open, so I'm going to mute myself if they make noise.
Oh, that's fine, no worries. So I think these multiple definitions, I actually find them quite useful because it means that you can look at empathy in different contexts. And I think I'm very specific about saying I'm looking at empathy within filmmaking because I don't have the expertise that, say, Marco has to talk about it within a psychological or psychiatric context. And I'm not a philosopher either, so I know that philosophy uses empathy quite differently too. So I'm using empathy within its kind of film studies context. And there are sort of, there's some very early definitions around empathy, and the one that I found most useful for my purposes was one that came from Alex Neil called feeling with. The idea that if you distinguish sympathy from empathy, sympathy is about feeling for someone, so I feel sorry for you, but I don't share your emotional space, I don't share your emotions, I'm still disconnected, even though I might be sympathetic, and that's generally a positive emotion. It's not the same emotion. Whereas this idea of empathy that he adopts and that I adopted in my thesis is the idea of feeling with. So in other words, in a film, if a character that we're encouraged to empathise with is feeling sad, feeling sorry, or feeling hurt, we should feel that hurt too. We should feel that emotion in terms of how it's portrayed by the actor, in terms of how the music kind of elicits an emotional response, or indeed how it's lit. Lighting in itself can really affect how we respond to a scene, whether we respond to that scene in a positive or a negative way. So for me, it was quite a basic definition, and I know that's not very nuanced compared to many of the academics you've talked to, but it's a basic idea of feeling with another person, in this case, feeling with the character on screen. And if you think back to, all the conventions of mainstream cinema, most of the characters that are held up as the hero or the heroine of the journey, that's the person that the director wants you to feel with, So in a romantic comedy, you want to feel elated when the couple are, united. In a horror movie, you want to feel scared when the person's being chased down the corridor. So it's that idea of feeling with the character that you're looking at on screen. But I suppose in the context of mental illness, it's important to state that, okay, so we have this relationship of empathy with a character with a mental illness or a character who's treated as mentally ill. Then what happens next? And I think that's what the symposium was about, was taking that question of empathy the next step and going, okay, well, if we can establish this relationship of empathy, what does that contribute to our understanding of mental illness? What are some of the positives, and indeed what are some of the negatives of that feeling with another person? So one of the things we explored was if a character on screen is going through a difficult time, particularly a psychotic episode, and the director chooses to immerse you as the viewer in that psychotic episode, they might use techniques of cinematography, music, sound effects, performance. That feeling of empathy is not always going to be pleasant, and I think it's important to note that empathy in film, at least, can be a very challenging emotion for the audience. And what that means is the audience might recoil from that and say, oi, I'm not going there. Or even if they do go on that journey and they are willing to feel the sense of disorientation or dislocation that a character's feeling, that can be quite a traumatic viewing experience. So, for example, some of the films that I teach at Melbourne Uni in human rights on screen, we're dealing with characters, whether they're fictional characters or in a documentary, a real person, characters that have been through very difficult, trying, traumatic circumstances. And it's asking a lot of the audience to empathise with trauma, but I think sometimes that's important for the audience to really engage with the human rights issue that's at the core of the film that they're describing. So in many ways, empathy in film for me, it's a relationship of trust between the filmmaker and the audience. The audience is placing, I guess, their sense of emotional identification in the hands of the director, the actor, the writer. And even if those emotions that they share are not always positive emotions, they can be negative emotions, what comes out the other side is a sense of understanding, a sense of being informed about how someone else lives that I didn't know about before. And it's that idea of the intentionality behind the desire to empathise. So I think it was important that we called the symposium Try Walking in My Shoes. It wasn't just a mathematical equation of if you watch a film with a character, you will walk in their shoes. It doesn't always happen, but it's the intentionality to try walking in another person's shoes, or indeed to see the world through another person's eyes, that I think is really what's at the core and what matters. And in these days, with greater awareness of mental health, where people know that within their family, within their friendship circles, I think the statistics in Australia say 1 in 4 people will go through an experience of mental illness at some point. We all have to have this desire and this intentionality to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, to see the world through their eyes, because that way will break down the stigma, the discrimination and the fear that surrounds mental health or mental health issues.
Well, You know, my vision that I'm working towards is how do we build a culture of empathy? So really raise the level of empathy. And
Yep.
I see that as the starting point, too. What you're saying is about the intention. That, you know, if we want to start building a culture, raising the level of empathy, we have to have the intention to do that, to take the steps, and to start looking for steps we can take to take actions to build that culture. And I guess I was wondering, what do you see as the reasons for having that intention, right? What is the, it's like, why would someone have the intention to create more empathy in the world? And, you know, I've got all kinds of ideas about that, but I'm wondering what you would see as maybe intentions people might have.
Well, I guess to start with, I'd come back to film and my little corner of the world, and that is when we go to watch a film, we actually go willingly because we want to go on a journey. That's part of the escapism of film. That's part of the entertainment value of film, is to be taken out of your everyday world, to be taken to the other side of the world, to be taken to another time period, you know, whether in the past or the future. We actually already have that intentionality, if you like, to go on a journey that's outside of ourselves when we choose to sit down and watch a TV show or choose to watch a film. So I think the very act of sitting down to watch something on the screen, implicit in that is a desire upon the viewer to go somewhere else. You know, and depending on what you choose, you know, you might choose to watch a light comedy because you just want a bit of romantic comedy, a bit of a relief from your stresses of everyday life. But in the case of, say, the more substantial material that I work with, human rights films in particular, we have a fantastic festival here in Melbourne called the Human Rights Arts and Film Festival, which has been going for a number of years now. And every year the audiences for that get bigger. I think that's really an interesting thing to reflect upon. There's obviously a desire within audiences to see these kinds of films that not only take them to another country, another culture outside their own, but to engage with films that are more substantive than just popcorn entertainment. You know, there's a hunger for audiences to learn about these things, and whether it's because people are aware of the extent to which, you know, domestic mainstream media only tells half the story, maybe that's it. So there could be some political awareness that people have there. But also it could be a desire to encounter filmmaking that's different to the norm, because you're dealing with issues that are not obviously commercially palatable. Human rights issues don't sell tickets at the box office. The filmmakers, therefore, are doing things more creatively to engage audience awareness. And so I think something like human rights films in particular are embedded in a culture of people who are already engaged in these issues to some extent, but want to come at them from a different angle. So are using film in a way that you can't communicate, I guess, some of the urgency or some of the emotional content of a human rights issue through a UN briefing paper or through an article in the Wall Street Journal. It's a different mode of communication. So I think, I guess there's an intentionality that comes from that intentionality to sit down and to be entertained and to escape. That's one form of intentionality. But there's another form of intentionality that maybe comes from a degree of political awareness, or just a hunger for something new and something different. And I think what I see in the Human Rights Arts Film Festival is a film festival that's different, that has not just different films, but different events around those films. So they have discussion panels, Q&As, the kind of Skype conversation that we're doing now. And they offer a richer engagement with film that's socially and politically grounded. And I think for a lot of people that's tapping into something that's unique about cinema. That it isn't just an entertainment medium only. It's a medium for provocation, for action, for political awareness, and just opening your eyes in a different way.
Yeah, it seems like film is one of the most, perhaps the most powerful, engaging medium we have out there. So,
well, it's interesting too, in the age of TV, and particularly quality TV and HBO, I think it's harder and harder to get people to leave the comfort of their homes to actually go to a cinema. You know, it's very easy just to watch it, you know, download whatever film, you know, is out there. So I think what something like a Human Rights Arts and Film Festival offers is a unique viewing experience that cannot be replicated at home, and it's a collective viewing experience. So what's very apparent to me in the screens I've been to is it's a communal viewing experience. You have 200 to 300 people there watching a film that might be dealing with, you know, religious persecution in France where the girls are forbidden from wearing the hijab, or a film that's dealing with, you know, the dislocation that an asylum seeker faces when they're relocated to a completely foreign culture. What you get is that shared emotional space with that communal viewing experience, and the conversations that flow from that afterwards are just so inspiring, and that you can't replicate at home on your couch. You just can't. So for me, it's really important that cinema in the 21st century gets reinvented in these ways so that people still have a desire to go out and see films in a theatre, at a festival, with other people. Because, again, that's that idea of connection that we were talking about before. Film offers connection and offers that embracive, collective, emotional feeling. It's a shared emotional experience when you go and see a film in a cinema, and that's so different.
Yeah, for me, that's when I think of the intention, it's like, why do I want to, foster empathy, create more empathy, experience empathy? I was thinking of the work of Carl Rogers, and he says, it feels damn good. So it's just a felt experience. I mean, it kind of breaks it down to it just feels really good to have that sense of connection, that sense of belonging, that sense of inclusion, that sense of warmth, that sense of community. So it's all a very viscerally, it's a nourishing experience.
I should say that was something that was really important to us in the symposium when we were bringing everyone together, because the symposium was kind of, as far as we can tell, the first of its kind in Australia, at least, where it was within an academic context, but we didn't want it to be just a bunch of academics standing around talking about films and TV shows dealing with mental illness. From the outset, we were really clear that this had to be an event that was inclusive, that had that sense of community, and that had that sense, I guess, of being positive and constructive in its dialogue, because my concern was it was very easy to simply repeat the old complaints, which are still valid complaints, but they're very much old complaints about TV and media and film perpetuating negative stereotypes. Now, we still have those negative stereotypes, we're still trying to counter them, but I really wanted to take the dialogue to the next step, and I wanted it to be a positive experience for people to come together and talk about what are some of the positive things that film and TV can contribute to how we understand mental illness and how we as a community deal with it. So from the outset, we invited not just academics, but we invited filmmakers and TV producers, because I thought that was really important to have the perspective of the people making these documentaries and making these feature films. But we also invited mental health consumers, that is the people who are dealing with the mental health system in their everyday life, who are dealing with the stigma and the stereotypes that might be perpetuated by media, and mental health professionals, because we felt there was the need for a dialogue between these four groups. When I was researching for my PhD, I was looking for literature on mental illness in film. And what really struck me was the bulk of the literature, probably 2/3 of it, is written by mental health professionals. And that's important and valid that they are a part of the conversation. But I looked at this conversation and I thought, well, where are all the screen scholars? Where are all the people dealing with mental illness in their everyday lives? And I wanted to create that space where we could have an exchange of ideas that was productive and fruitful. And I guess that, for me, was the most exciting thing about the symposium, was the positivity of the environment we managed to create. We did some informal feedback surveys at the end of the second day, and we asked people what they enjoyed about the symposium and what they thought we could do better. And overwhelmingly, the feedback was positive, and it really talked about this idea of having created a safe space for people to share their perspectives and their journeys. It was really important for me, for example, that we had a couple of consumers of mental health actually talking openly in a workshop about their responses to film and TV. One of them even showed a film that she'd made about her own experience with bipolar. And a lot of people picked out that workshop as one of the highlights for them of the 2 days, because it meant that we were getting to hear voices that don't often get heard in these debates. And it meant that by having two people standing up there saying, I have bipolar and this is my life journey and how I deal with, film and TV in my everyday life, it meant that other people in the audience felt safe to share their stories as well. And so it was truly a really positive example of empathy in action, because for me it was about me as an academic being willing to hear from a different perspective, from a filmmaker or from a mental health consumer or from a professional, but also their willingness, again, this idea of intentionality, if you like, to also share those perspectives. So for me it felt amazing. I didn't think it was going to go off as well as it did, and I think everyone at the end of the 2 days was saying, when can we do it again? When are you doing another one? I was like, oh, I'll just recover from this one. But clearly there's a hunger and a thirst and a need for these sorts of really fruitful, informed dialogues. They're not just informal chats over coffee, as valuable as they are. They're informed by research, they're informed by lived experience, and they're driven by a desire to learn from someone else and to learn from their perspective. So for me, it felt really good, even though we were dealing with really heavy-duty subject matter, and that can be quite depressing and quite traumatic for people. I think we created a safe space in which people felt that if they needed some time out, they could, but no one really became overly upset or traumatized or anxious by what we were dealing with, and I think that was very important to me, and indeed to the people behind the symposium. I should say something too about where we held the symposium. It was really a wonderful venue. It's a place called the Dax Centre, and the Dax Centre at the University of Melbourne actually has a mission to use art to help create greater understanding of mental illness and trauma. So they have an interest in visual art and representations of mental illness and trauma through painting, through drawing, and they get a lot of people who have had experiences of mental illness and trauma who are willing to share their art, do this in a gallery-style exhibition. But they also have an education program, and their education program is all about the way in which art can foster our understanding and indeed our empathy for people with these lived experiences. And it's interesting that empathy is one of the core concepts within the mission for the Dax Centre. So there was a wonderful, I guess, marriage, if you like, between the ambitions that we had for the symposium's program and the mission that the Dax Centre has as a centre that's trying to foster a culture of empathy that you talked about. You know, I think it's a really good example of how organisations can contribute to a culture of empathy, and the Dax Centre is certainly doing that here in Melbourne.
Well, that's what I'm really wondering about is how was it, I mean, the conference was framed around empathy and film and mental illness, but having that empathy framework and kind of moving towards empathy, how would you say that worked as a methodology? I'm hearing that you have that as the framework, and then you're bringing in a wide variety of people, making it very inclusive. And my sense would be that the theme of empathy itself really helps people to connect and communicate.
I think that's what attracted people to the event generally, was by putting empathy up front in the title, in the questions that we asked of people to consider. They knew that we were trying to do something different and something that was positive and constructive rather than negative. And I think that therefore framed the papers and the proposals we received. We actually made it really clear too that although, as I said, it's had an academic kind of framework and an academic context, that we didn't just want a whole series of academic papers. We also wanted people to present workshops, which several people did. We had not only the mental health consumers I told you about, but we had a filmmaker presenting their work in a workshop style, so they'd actually show clips of their films, invite audience feedback and discussion. We had someone from the Dax Centre, where they've been making short films with people with a lived experience, talk about how they approach the idea of using film to document the lived experience. And we also had a tour of the gallery of the Dax Centre. So I think what we tried to do was incorporate that sense of interdisciplinarity in our speakers with a range of kind of mixed modes, if you like, of engagement, so that once again we got beyond this sense of it being an academic conference that might be intimidating, or that might send a message to the audience that, oh, you're simply passive recipients of all this wisdom that we have, you know. So even when it came to having our keynote speakers, we had 3 fabulous keynote speakers from quite different perspectives. We had a philosopher called Raymond Gator, who's very well known here in Australia and I think in the UK. He talked about the limits of empathy and talked about it not only from his perspective as a philosopher, but from his personal experience as a child of parents who both had periods of mental illness while he was growing up. Now, his personal story is very tragic and traumatic, but I think the kind of discussion he invited us to have as a result of his keynote lecture was a discussion about exploring empathy and how far it can go, and whether it needs to be buttressed with questions of morality and questions of ethics as well. And I think while we were very mindful that we were dealing with someone's real story of childhood trauma, he was sharing this with us with a view to advancing our understanding of empathy. And that was really important. And you could just tell from the questions that were asked afterwards and the discussions that continued that it wasn't simply a grand philosopher standing at a lectern imparting wisdom. It was very much a shared experience. And I think also our other keynotes, we had a keynote speaker from University of Queensland, Jane Stadler, who studies film and TV. And she was really very great for setting up early on our framework of empathy, because she wanted to explore, as I mentioned before, some of the negative aspects of empathy as well as the positive. So what it means for an audience member to go on a journey with a character who's having a negative experience. And it was really good for teasing out the consequences of that for film and TV producers. So she had it within a film studies framework, Raymond had it within a philosophy framework, And our other keynote speaker, Barbara Creed, she's a professor at Melbourne Uni as well. She's got a particular interest in the relationship between humans and animals and the extent to which there can be shared emotional connection between humans and animals, and indeed the possibility of empathy between humans and animals. So I think it was really clear from the outset, from the choices of keynote speakers and from the way we framed our questions for people to answer, that we were looking at empathy in all its many varieties, its contexts, its riches, and in a way that was, all-inclusive with the definition, all-inclusive with who gets to speak about it, and not actually trying to have the last word on empathy. I think I said at the outset that this is hopefully the beginning of many fruitful discussions that we'll have, and I certainly get the feeling that people will want to continue talking about it in this way.
Well, we were talking about the definition of empathy before, and I want to just give a little bit of a framework here. For me, there's like 4 basic components of empathy. One would be self-empathy, so that's like a sensory awareness of what's happening inside of our own experience. And then there's what I'm calling mirrored empathy, which is feeling along with someone. So as I wave my hand, there's like mirror neurons. You know, you're feeling the energy and your enthusiasm and moving. I'm feeling your enthusiasm with the event. And then there's this part of imaginative empathy, which is kind of the role playing, like the actor saying, I am stepping into the shoes, and it seems to be we can take the role of anything. I can take the role of this mouse, like what is it to be a mouse, or what is it like to be you, and so we can pretty much imagine ourselves in any situation, or maybe even imagine myself in the future, in a sense, empathize with myself in the future. So that would be that imaginative empathy. And then the last part is the empathic creativity and action. So there's something about when we really empathize deeply with each other, that there's like kind of this sparks that kind of come out of that in new directions for where we want to go, that's kind of elicited by that that connection that we've had, that empathic connection. Instead of somebody saying, go do this, it's like we just kind of do it out of that joint experience of empathy. So I'm wondering, from this whole experience, what kind of empathic creativity and action happened?
That's great. I think, well, first of all, those 4 concepts of empathy that you've outlined, I think all 4 of them were very much being activated through the 2 days of the symposium. I think what we were exploring was the extent to which film invites us to mirror what a character's going through. And in that process of mirroring, we actually become aware of our own self and our own emotional engagement with the film. So we definitely explored self-empathy in that mirroring. Obviously, as I've talked about before, film taps into our ability to imaginatively empathise and go somewhere else. And that last thing, that empathy leading to action, well, there was certainly, as I said, this desire from people who filled out the survey and who talked to me afterwards to continue these discussions in some form. So, for example, at the University of Melbourne, there's already an initiative in place called the Global, let me think of the title, Cultural and Global Mental Health Film Initiative, CGMH. And basically it's a colleague of mine at Melbourne Uni, Erminia Colucci, who's both a psychologist and an anthropologist, who had this idea that she could use documentary films as a way of sharing insights into other cultures and how they deal with mental health issues. And she started this by sheer coincidence the year before we had the symposium. And the minute I heard about this film initiative, which was a monthly screening of a documentary film followed by discussion, I said, that's exactly what our symposium is about. It's about using film to create discussion, to provide awareness, give insight, and hopefully lead to a better culture around mental health in Australia. So obviously I got in contact with Erminia because I was really excited by her initiative, and she was one of our key collaborators in putting the symposium together. Now that film initiative is continuing, so that's one kind of aspect of, I guess, action that has been encouraged by and supported by the symposium. But there's also attached to this idea of the symposium the idea of not simply watching films but actually collaborating with filmmakers and making your own films. So we saw that with the mental health consumers I told you about. Maria Dimopoulos and Diana Lombardozzi are themselves artists, art therapists, and people with lived experience of bipolar. And they've each gone on to make films of their experience. Now, I think what's so exciting for this era we live in of digital filmmaking is that we now have the tools that make filmmaking accessible to just about anyone who can get their hands on a camera, who can get their hands on the software. But importantly, particularly for people dealing with mental health issues, there are more organisations that are willing to support that process of filmmaking. So Aminia, who I told you about, has also collaborated with the Multicultural Health Council here in Australia to help develop and workshop a series of short films, digital storytelling projects, with not only people with a lived experience of mental illness, but a lived experience of living in a different culture in Australia. So they're people from migrant backgrounds, refugee backgrounds, who have the kind of the double dilemma, if you like, of living in a foreign culture and living with a mental illness. So they produced a whole suite of short films, which have had many screenings around Victoria and hopefully will travel interstate. And I do know that there's also been a group up in Sydney, the Mental Health Council up in Sydney, that have done a similar digital storytelling project, which has put the camera in the hands of people who've had a lived experience with mental illness and said, go tell your story. And I was very fortunate to go up to Sydney for the launch of this particular film, and they had a behind-the-scenes, making-the-scenes documentary about what it was like for these people who had had no previous experience with filmmaking, what it was like to come together as a team of people to learn how to operate a camera, learn how to write a script, learn how to act, lighting, all that kind of thing. And what was really clear from that forum was it wasn't just the film itself that was valuable in itself, but also the experience of the filmmaking, of coming together as a collective team to tell a story about living with mental illness and putting that out there. And for me, that was really fabulously inspiring to see the act of filmmaking, not simply the act of viewing film, but the act of filmmaking itself as being an act of collective emotion sharing. So collective empathy.
Yeah.
So I guess, you know, the symposium hasn't necessarily initiated these activities themselves, but I think the symposium is part of a wave of activities, at least within Melbourne and Sydney, that are beginning to tap into the ability of film to begin discussions, to open different ways of participation and self-actualisation or self-realisation, particularly for those with mental health issues. And for me, that's where it's truly exciting.
Well, this is very exciting for me too. I can really feel your excitement. I feel excited and enthused by your excitement and your articulateness in explaining all this. So it's really a lot of fun.
I hope so.
So is there any, we probably should close, so is there any kind of final thoughts in terms of getting in contact with you? There's going to be a link down below in the discussion area that anyone can follow. I got a web page for information about you, or is there any URL that you'd like to get out there or anything like that?
Sure. Well, I think I should say from the outset that something like this symposium would simply not have got off the ground if we hadn't had two organisations that really believed in the project from the start. I mentioned the DAX Centre, DAX, and I'll give you their URL so that you can put it up on your web. But I think they're a really important example of a mental health organisation that really taps into the power of empathy through art to get their message across. And I think they're doing some very exciting things, some great exhibitions, great conferences, great symposia. And I really appreciated their guidance because, as I mentioned at the outset, I'm not a mental health professional, and there are lots of sensitivities and lots of politics around mental health, and I didn't want to offend anyone, I didn't want to upset anyone, and I really did rely on the DAX Centre to kind of give me that framework within which I could operate. So it was really important to me that I had their guidance and their sensitivity. But another organisation that also believed in the project from the start is an academic organisation, but one that has a real interest in education and outreach, and that's the Centre for the History of Emotions here in Australia. And the Centre for the History of Emotions is basically 8 different universities who are all collaborating through their research to look at not just emotions in contemporary society, but the history of emotions going right back to Europe between the 1100s and the 1800s. And their mission, if you like, as historians, is to look at how our modern day understandings of emotions like empathy have developed over time, what's changed, and how, particularly in Australia, our relationship to Europe informs our understanding of emotions. So for them, it was kind of a bit of a leap of faith. Because their focus is very much on the history of emotions, to have something as seemingly modern as a symposium looking at film and TV required a bit of a leap of faith, but I think they took that leap because they could see we were making connections across the 20th century and back into earlier times to look at how this concept of empathy is quite a modern concept. It's not something we've had for a long time. I'm sure your other scholars have talked about the history of empathy and how it's been developed over time. And the fact that in earlier periods, empathy was regarded with suspicion and hostility, and it's not something that was indeed encouraged or condoned to necessarily empathise with somebody else. So I think it's interesting that there is a historical discussion, a historical investigation behind empathy, and the Centre for the History of Emotions are doing amazing work, very rich work around the history of emotions. So I'll make sure you've got their URL as well, so that if people want to, read a bit more about their research, they can do so.
Okay,
and I wrote
great.
I wrote a piece for their blog that just reflected on, I think, the emotional experience of organising the symposium as well. So I was invited to write a more personal piece, which was interesting because as an academic, you're always writing sort of investigative or analytical pieces of writing. And at the outset, the person who put the blog together said to me, I would like you to write a personal reflection on how you found the symposium and organising it. So for me, that was a bit of a challenge as a writer, but it was a good exercise to do because it actually tapped into exactly what I've been talking about, which is this idea of empathy in action through the symposium.
Well, we'll have links to all those resources. There'll be links from this. This will be on YouTube, and there'll be a link to it, to all those different links. And I hope we can keep the dialogue going. It sounds like you'll be doing more of these conferences or symposiums in the future, and continuously be working on this topic of empathy. So it sounds like it's an ongoing endeavor, doing more publications, more events. I saw you mention that, and I'm in it for the long term too, so I hope we can maybe collaborate in some way and keep the dialogue going. It's a lot of fun talking to you.
Yeah, it would be really great because we didn't want the symposium to be the beginning and the end of this discussion. And we said at the outset we want to create more events like this. We want to have publications come out of it. So we do hope to publish an edited collection of papers from the symposium. I've still got to work on my book, turning my PhD into a book. So there is hopefully going to be a long life behind this investigation of empathy.
Are you working around empathy in the book too? Is that
working
into the book?
The book has a working title called The Shine Factor, and it's essentially this idea that Shine was a perfect example of a film that tapped into our ability to empathise with a character dealing with mental illness. And I really want to explore in that book films that have what I call the Shine Factor, that is that ability to take us on that journey with a character. So distinguishing a group of films from the vast majority of films that have had very negative stigmatizing portrayals. I'm looking at those films that have had positive, empathetic portrayals. So hopefully it's very much a work in progress, but that's where I'm headed. Okay,
great. Well, it's been a real pleasure, talking to you. And if you have any thoughts, any kind of next steps, let me know, because I'm wanting to keep going and have all kinds of ideas for actual participatory type activities and things like that. So
it's funny you should say next steps, because we have been talking about try walking in my shoes, the next steps. So
oh, the next steps. Try walking in my shoes, the next steps. Nice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then I'll hit the stop button, and thank you so much, Fincina, for doing this dialogue with me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Edwin. Thanks for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
Okay.